This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Susie Gehring.
Global tensions. The conflict in Ukraine flares up again, pressuring stocks, overshadowing better economic data here at home. And that isn't the only event overseas investors need to watch. Bounce back, a key indicator of the housing market's health, rises, but there may be more to that report than meets the eye. And minimize the impact. Worried about the hack attack on JP Morgan? Some steps you can take to protect yourself and your small business. We have all that and more tonight on Nightly Business Report for Thursday, August 28th. Good evening, everyone. Tyler's off tonight. A tug of war on Wall Street today as investors weighed encouraging data about the U.S. economy against geopolitical flare-ups that are threatening markets all around the globe. Here in the U.S., a new report showed that the economy grew faster in the second quarter, much stronger than forecast. The gross domestic product, or GDP, rose 4.2% as businesses spent more money and added more jobs. Also surprising economists, fewer people filed for unemployment benefits as first-time jobless claims fell by 1,000. But reports that Russian combat troops entered Ukraine spooked investors, and all the major averages turned negative. The Dow lost 42 points, the Nasdaq was off by about 12, and the S&P fell by 3 points. And then this afternoon, President Obama made clear his stance on the conflict.
Russia is responsible for the violence in eastern Ukraine. The violence is encouraged by Russia. The separatists are trained by Russia. They are armed by Russia. They are funded by Russia. Russia has deliberately and repeatedly violated the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine.
We begin tonight with more on those Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine and why Wall Street is worried.
Russia faces the possibility of more economic sanctions from the West due to increased evidence that the Russian military is operating in eastern Ukraine. The leader of Germany, Angela Merkel, announced today during a news conference that at an EU summit on Saturday, they will consider the possibility of new sanctions because of the new evidence, which includes satellite images released today by NATO. NATO says they show Russian combat military forces doing military operations inside the sovereign territory of Ukraine. And a brigadier general at NATO estimates there are 1,000 Russian troops operating in Ukraine. This comes on top of Ukrainians capturing 10 Russian paratroopers earlier in the week, 12 miles from the Russian border. The Russian media today, quoting anonymous sources, says that the soldiers got lost. And it was big news in Russia, the mothers of those soldiers appearing on national television begging for their return. Also on Russian TV today, Alexander Zakharchenko. He's the self-proclaimed prime minister of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. He told Russian state television that, yes, 3,000 to 4,000 Russians have fought on the separatist side since April. But he called them patriots, didn't necessarily say that they were members of the military. Put all of those things together, and it suggests a deep escalation of the conflict, both militarily and also economically. For Nightly Business Report, Michelle Caruso Cabrera.
Now, another global concern for investors is what's happening in Europe, where banking officials are considering a U.S.-style monetary easing program. But will it work in Europe, and what are the risks? Steve Leisman has that story.
Nobody knows what ECB President Mario Draghi and Fed Chair Janet Yellen talked about when they met last week in Jackson Hole. What's known is this: Europe is in the throes of a critical debate about whether to follow the U.S. down the path of an American-style quantitative easing program. The debate heated up after Draghi and Jackson Hole said that inflation and inflation expectations are falling, and said he was concerned. He said the ECB's governing council, quote, will acknowledge these developments at its meeting next week. That in turn raised expectations for further action, if not next week, then in the months ahead. Former Fed Governor Rick Mishkin says, quote, they need to do shock and awe. They are so far behind the curve, end quote. But there are some potential problems. Europe, after all, is not the United States, and there could be political objections from Germany and other countries. Plus, rates are already very low in Europe.
The idea of doing quantitative easing sounds good because they're doing something. Their economy is slowing. Inflation is a little lower than they would like. Let's do something. But if you look at the treasury yields in Germany, Italy, Spain, most of them are at or below where the U.S. 10-year yield is right now. And so the question is, if you were to go and buy a lot of government debt in Europe, what would you possibly achieve? And the answer is probably not much.
Will there be any benefit? According to economists, these are the ways QE is supposed to work. There's a credit effect which drives down interest rates, a portfolio effect which forces investors into riskier assets, and maybe most important of all, an expectations effect, convincing markets the central bank is all in on fighting inflation. But the dangers include capital misallocation, which forces investors to put money in places they may not be comfortable. When rates rise back up, that money could flee back to bonds and create a destabilizing decline in stocks. Question is whether the risk, a Japanese-style deflation in Europe that could last for decades, makes QE a gamble worth taking. That's certainly a choice Yellen made as she wholeheartedly supported QE in the United States. And it's not too far a stretch to think that maybe, just maybe, that's what she told Draghi when they met last week. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Steve Leisman.
Another critical sector of the U.S. economy had some positive news today. More home buyers were out in July than in June, sending pending home sales up 3.3% to an 11-month high. But those pending sales are still slower than they were last year, and there's some concern behind that headline number. Diana Olick explains why.
This is your sign right here on the back.
Home seller Steve Rocklin is getting more realistic about the housing market.
There's just not a lot of people spending $1 million for houses like there was 7 or 8 years ago.
Rocklin, a contractor, is downsizing from his $1 million home in the Roswell section of Atlanta. He actually built the subdivision in which he lives.
Everybody's gone off to college and moved out, so it's time for us to sell.
Rocklin is just what the market needs right now: more sellers, more listings. The expectation had been that there would be more downsizing baby boomers, but the housing crash left too many of them unable to sell.
There are definitely still some people that are either flatlined in what they purchased for, or still just a little bit underneath where they purchased. And it is creating a situation where sometimes they do have to hold on to their property.
Limited supply has left little choice for buyers and pushed prices higher at the same time.
I would say it's a tough market for buyers right now. It's still, it's floating back and forth, but it's still a little bit of a seller's market where the price points are, maybe a little bit higher than what buyers are normally used to.
Home prices are still rising nationwide, but those gains are slowing down. As all cash investors move out and mortgage-dependent buyers move in, sticker shock is hitting sales.
Our survey data suggests that people are more conservative about the biggest ticket item that they will probably undertake in their life, which is buying a house, than people commonly believe.
Duncan cut his forecast for home sales next year, claiming it was too optimistic. Rocklin, though, is still hopeful.
The market is at the best it's been in the last 3 years.
But is that saying enough? For Nightly Business Report, I'm Diana Olick in Washington.
Joining us now to talk about all of this, Linda Piegza. She is chief economist at Stern AG, and Paul Christopher. He's chief international investment strategist at Wells Fargo Advisors. And welcome to both of you. Paul, let me begin with you on this tug of war, as we're describing it, between the health of the U.S. economy and the escalation of the crisis between Russia and the Ukraine. Are you split on which one you're focusing on?
No, I think the foundation for investors making investment decisions in this country is really the U.S. economy, which is in better shape than it was in 2008, the last time we had a lot of trouble. I think the housing will continue to improve. Also, investment. We're seeing more about mergers and acquisitions and a lot more buying at the operational level of durable goods, and that will also give the economy a tailwind going forward.
Lindsay, do you agree with that as you hear all of this kind of warmongering talk from overseas?
I do agree. I think investors right now are certainly paying attention to what's happening on the global markets, but the focus right now is very much what's happening in the U.S. economy. And unfortunately, it's been very uneven. Of course, we did see a much better print this morning for second quarter GDP, raising that up 0.2 to 4.2%. But remember, that comes against the backdrop of a very steep decline at the start of the year. So investors right now are trying to figure out which one really tells the story, the health of the labor market and the economy in general. Now, going forward, we've already seen that declining trend in consumption carry forward into the third quarter. And so I think a lot of investors are really trying to glean exactly where the improvement is going to come from if we do continue to gain ground in the second half.
Let me ask you this, Paul. You probably heard President Obama late this afternoon talking about the whole situation in Russia. He was asked a question about whether he was going to take any more actions in terms of sanctions against Russia, and he didn't really answer that question. But let's say come September that there is a step up in U.S. sanctions against Russia or from Europe. Would you be changing your investment strategy based on that?
Possibly. The main risk all along has been that Russia would infiltrate Ukraine to such a degree that Europe and the United States would be left with no choice but to impose the maximum level sanctions, which so far they've avoided. Now, we've heard the President and Chancellor Merkel say that they're going to huddle up this weekend and start thinking about what to do next, how to respond. And it is possible that they would jump to that level of maximum sanctions on the Russian, especially on the Russian energy sector. But I rather think that they'll still be incremental about this going forward. I don't think they want to go to the max sanctions because that would really hit the European economy hard.
And Lindsay, if that were to hurt the European economy, what kind of ripple effect would that have here in the U.S. for big U.S. international companies?
That's a great question, because that really is where I see the largest impact in breaking down the trade barriers, or excuse me, the trade relationship between Russia and the European economies. That will certainly restrict European growth, which is already very fragile. And if we continue to see that, well, that will certainly dampen then European demand for U.S.-made goods. And so while I don't think there would be a significant direct impact, it is that second level or the second derivative impact that I'm very concerned about. And remember that a lot of economists were looking for 4% GDP in the second half of the year, predicated on a revival from European growth, spurring demand for U.S.-made goods and really giving a boost to exports.
Do you still see that that's possible, to see the U.S. economy growing in the second half, given this situation going on internationally?
Certainly. But remember, we expect very modest growth, looking for around 1.5% to 2% GDP. So certainly not the gangbuster 3 or 4% that we saw in the second quarter, but still positive growth nonetheless.
You know, I was interested, Paul, that you were telling me earlier today that you've been putting some of your portfolio money into Europe. I mean, given all of this uncertainty in Europe, why do you think that that's a good investment move?
Well, principally because we think this conflict will be limited and it will be transitory. We think ultimately Russia will manage to keep leverage in Ukrainian politics, enough leverage to have some influence there. That's all the Russians really seem to want anyway. They seem to have achieved that. The Ukrainian military really is, I think, not going to be able to kick the Russians out. I don't think the Europeans will go for full max level sanctions. I could be wrong there, but I don't think they opt that course. And with that said, I think eventually this conflict becomes more localized and eventually falls off investors' radar screens. And with that in mind, I think then the sell-off that we've been seeing in Europe becomes a buying opportunity, a real value opportunity for economies that will do better in the future.
All right. Thank you both so much for your comments and analysis. Appreciate it. Lindsay Piegza at Stern AG and Paul Christopher from Wells Fargo Advisors. And still ahead, as J.P. Morgan and the FBI investigate a cyber attack, what can individuals and small business owners do to protect themselves? That's coming up. A breakthrough in the battle to contain the Ebola outbreak in East Africa. GlaxoSmithKline is gearing up for the first human trials of a vaccine for the Ebola virus. Shares of Glaxo rose nearly 0.5% today on that news. Meg Terrell has more on the growing Ebola crisis and what a successful vaccine could mean for Glaxo and the other drug makers.
The Ebola outbreak continues to accelerate. The World Health Organization says 40% of the cases occurred in just the last 3 weeks. The organization today outlined an Ebola response roadmap with a goal of stopping the virus's spread in affected countries within 6 to 9 months and preventing international spread. The plan assumes that overall cases may actually be 2 to 4-fold higher than what's currently reported, and says the total number infected could top 20,000 over the course of the outbreak. This for a disease with a 52% reported fatality rate. The WHO put a budget of $490 million on the plan. Separately, news came today on a potential vaccine. Testing in people is scheduled to start next week on an Ebola vaccine being co-developed by GlaxoSmithKline and the National Institutes of Health. Results are expected by the end of this year. GlaxoSmithKline said that with a grant from the Wellcome Trust and others in the UK, it'll begin manufacturing an additional 10,000 doses. So if the trials are successful, stocks could be made available immediately to the WHO. Donna Altenpole, Vice President of U.S. Public Policy at GlaxoSmithKline, described the goal of the studies.
What we're really looking for is for any adverse side effects, as well as is it producing the immune response that we need to help control and prevent the Ebola disease. That should happen at the end of 2014, and then it will be up to the World Health Organization what to do after that. Will we go into phase 2? Or will they make the decision to actually use the vaccine in high-risk populations, particularly healthcare workers?
Any commercial opportunity for a vaccine remains uncertain. One reason few pharmaceutical companies have worked in the space. Groups in the UK also plan to test the vaccine, and the NIH says it has plans to test a second potential Ebola vaccine from New Link Genetics later this year. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Meg Terrell.
A nasty earnings report from Abercrombie & Fitch is where we begin tonight's market focus. Same-store sales at the teen apparel retailer fell for the 10th straight quarter as it struggled to attract customers. The company did turn a profit in the second quarter, but that was fueled mostly because of cost-cutting and store closures. Shares fell nearly 5% to $41.87. Dollar General posted earnings that matched estimates, but its revenue and sales both missed. The discount retailer blamed a competitive environment and a cautious consumer. The disappointing results reaffirmed its interest in consolidating. The company told investors that it still wants to buy Family Dollar, even though its nearly $9 billion offer was rejected last week. Shares were up slightly to $64.20. Coty posted a big loss and a drop in revenues in its fiscal fourth quarter. The beauty products companies, whose brands include Calvin Klein fragrances, missed on both the top and bottom lines. Coty says it's targeting a return to revenue growth this fiscal year. But still, shares were down nearly 3.5% to $17.39. And the news Apple fans have been waiting for. The tech giant announced that it is hosting a special event at its Cupertino headquarters on September 9th. Now, it's widely expected that the company will unveil its new iPhone 6. But as expected, Apple was mysterious on the invitation, writing only the words, quote, "Wish we could say more." Shares rose a fraction to $102.25. That's a new record. And some of the nation's top banks continue to work with the FBI to determine the scope of a huge hack attack. As we reported last night, sophisticated hackers have reportedly gained access to computer systems and bank records of JPMorgan Chase and 6 other banks. This latest scheme has raised questions on how consumers and businesses can protect themselves against getting hacked. Our next guest says there are some simple steps to safeguard their personal information. He's Scott Goldman, CEO of Text Power. This is a website security firm. So, Scott, a lot of people have been very nervous looking at these headlines, and a lot of people do some of the basic anti-hack attack steps, and still they feel very vulnerable. How vulnerable are you to these big attacks on the big banks?
Well, in the ongoing cat and mouse game between security and hackers, chalk up another one for the mice. There are plenty of things that you can do to protect yourself, and I'd like to go through those steps with you. They are very basic and some things that will keep you protected.
Well, actually, you have a list here. You say choose a strong password. We always hear this. Change it frequently. So what's considered strong, and how frequently do you change it?
Well, this is kind of Security 101. What you want to do is select a password that does not contain dictionary words. It doesn't have your birthday. It doesn't have your dog's name in it. You want to choose something that's long, complicated. It's got a couple of symbols in it. And if you can pick a phrase, that would be really good. You want to change the password probably at least once every 90 days or so. And it would be good for businesses to have a policy that would force their people to change their passwords at least that frequently to keep it safe.
Okay. The next one on your list is subscribe to a multi-factor authentication process. You're going to have to translate what that means because it sounds a little complicated.
Sure, that's kind of geek speak for having another method to identify or verify your identification. So the way that that works is if you're a Gmail or a Facebook user, you're probably familiar with the process already. And the way that it works is very simply you opt in to receive a text message when you are logging into your account. And what you do is you enter your ID and password, and then a text message is sent to your phone, and in some cases you send one from your phone, and that message has a code in it, which you then would enter into a field on the screen, and that, because it's not associated with the website or the user ID or the password, identifies you with a third mechanism. That's what multi-factor means.
Let's go through some of these other ones because they're all good advice. Avoid bad links and emails, and also encrypt your computer. Tell us what those two mean.
Yeah, let's take the emails first. You would really be shocked at how good hackers have become at this. They're really extraordinarily artistic at developing emails that look exactly like what you would get from a large firm, from a Bank of America, from American Express. What you want to avoid at all costs is clicking on any of the links in those emails. If you get an email that says your account has been hacked, you need to verify your information, the best thing that you can do is to go directly to that website by typing in the address or by going to a trusted bookmark in your browser. Don't click on any of those links because it'll either take you to a bad place or you'll download a bad file.
Real quickly, if you're a small or medium-sized business, you don't have a big IT department, what's the best advice of what to do to prevent an attack?
Well, I think the best advice is to have policies that prevent people from clicking on links, downloading files. You don't want people downloading games or anything else because that contains nefarious code that can infect your entire system just by downloading it to one computer. It can then be transmitted through your entire network.
Lots of good advice. Thank you so much, Scott. Scott Goldman, CEO of Text Power. And coming up, the arms race for innovation and how big tech companies are partnering with a national laboratory to find solutions to complex problems. We turn now to a place called the Livermore Labs. This is the federally funded technology and medical research center that's attracting lots of interest and now investment from private companies. Josh Lipton takes a rare look inside the lab and at some of the projects being worked on.
This is a wafer that shows you what the devices look like.
Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is delivering a message to private industry.
So we've done a lot of upfront R&D.
It's open for business. We have a thermometer. Livermore gets about $1.5 billion in funding per year, mostly from the government, which goes to projects like this.
We can create temperatures of hundreds of millions of degrees.
The National Ignition Facility is the world's largest and most powerful laser. When fired, temperatures in the core reach tens of millions of degrees. Scientists use it to simulate nuclear weapons detonations. That helps the government manage the country's nuclear arsenal and provides insight on advanced energy research. Livermore is also a leader in high-powered computing. It's home to the world's third fastest computer, built by IBM, which can do things on a scale that industry can only dream of.
It might be noisy in here, but that's just the sound of a lot of computing going on. The Sequoia supercomputer can do 20 quintillion calculations per second. That's 20 million billion, or 20 with 15 zeros after it.
Companies, including General Electric, Exxon, and Boeing, use this computer when they need to complete complex simulations, which is useful since even the most powerful computers in the private sector are still years behind Sequoia, and most industries trail by a decade. Livermore is making a push to make this computing power more available to American industry, and scientists here say companies are finally taking advantage of it.
We're just beginning to get enough enough outside exposure that we're getting cold calls now. Companies are calling us and saying, look, I hear you have this capability. Can you possibly help me do this?
We put down the polymer first.
Livermore is also a pioneer when it comes to medical devices. This small sensor is helping the blind to see for the first time. And through a partnership with Second Sight Medical Devices, it's already been implanted in 100 people. But it might be a few years before we see this on a larger scale.
It's going to take 5 or 10 more years to get them to adopt it. Just because this technology is so far out there, the risk is really high.
The lab also recently partnered with Medtronic to work on neural implants that can help scientists better understand brain injuries of wounded soldiers. It's all part of the lab's push to transfer more of its advanced technologies into the private sector, which they say will help keep the American economy strong. And by getting more of these discoveries out on the market, they can help that many more people. Josh Lipton, Nightly Business Report, Livermore, California.
And finally tonight, a gadget called the Coolest Cooler has now raised more than $11 million from investors. It's becoming the highest funded project ever on Kickstarter. That's the online crowdfunding site. And the total could grow even more before the campaign closes at the end of the week. The high-tech cooler has a built-in blender, a cutting board, USB charger, a Bluetooth speaker system, and, of course, it keeps things cold. That's Nightly Business Report for tonight. I'm Susie Garrett. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great evening, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow night. I'm Susie Garrett with a Nightly Business Report news brief. A tug of war on Wall Street today as investors weighed encouraging data about the U.S. economy against reports of Russian combat troops entering Ukraine. Economic growth was better than forecast in the second quarter, up 4.2%, as businesses spent more money and added more jobs. Also, fewer Americans filed for unemployment benefits last week, and pending home sales rose last month to an 11-month high. But the Dow lost 42 points, the Nasdaq was off by about 12, and the S&P fell by 3 points. But Apple shares hit a new all-time high after the company announced a special event on September 9th, possibly a new device launch. And GlaxoSmithKline is gearing up for human trials of a new Ebola virus vaccine. Be sure to tune into Nightly Business Report right here on your public television station.